In keeping with our Pride Month topics of everybody has a right to parenthood, there are multiple paths to parenthood. And for gay dads, it can be in particularly complicated because you need a uterus. So there are 20,000 babies every year that are born via a gestational carrier in the US. So Serena, start us at the top with just the definition there of, traditional surrogacy versus gestational carrier.
So traditional surrogacy is basically where you find a woman who's going to give both the uterus and the egg. So she's the biologic mother and you do insemination and she carries your baby for you. The problem with that is that it's really not legal in the United States because, it's legally her baby and she would have to give the baby up for adoption, basically. So traditional surrogacy is really not a medical procedure that we use to create families. We use gestational surrogacy where the person that's carrying the baby is not related to the egg, so that you can, in certain states, not all states, but in certain states with the right legal advice, set it up ahead of time so that the carrier does not have parental responsibility, and the intended parents who put the whole package together, the egg and the sperm and the carrier or the uterus, will be the parents as they intended to be.
Now, Serena, have you seen throughout your career, have you seen more and more men embark on the parenthood journey this way, or has it stayed kind of flat? It's expensive.
It's still really tough because, because getting the egg and the uterus is somebody to carry your baby is a very expensive process. Even if you're not using donor eggs, it's probably $150,000, and then if you add egg donation, that's another probably 20, 40, possibly 60,000 on top of it. So if you have no coverage at all, if you do have coverage, some parts of this will be covered, but a huge part of it is non-medical stuff, like the legal, like compensating the donor, compensating the carrier, a lot of the logistical arrangements, insurance, things like that. So it is not only very expensive, but it's also a very big endeavor. And so I think it's for gay dads, it is very hard to access, but I think it's getting more and more accessible. We are seeing more legislation supportive of this. In New Jersey, the mandate, technically, if there is a medical issue causing infertility, you should be covered for surrogacy. So it's still a little bit gray, but we are seeing more access. A lot more needs to be done, but it's getting better.
I will say you throw out those numbers really fast, and for the vast majority of the United States, you could buy a house.
Yeah, I know that's
cash. Not in
very
California where I live, but in a lot of parts of the US, you really could, right? So it is daunting. And I will say that I've learned along the way that there are, financial education out there for people who have to embark on this aspect of the path to parenthood. There are, medical credit lines that people can access there. And I think that that's an important consideration. There's a great escrow company that has some educational material, both for the surrogates and for the intending parents, so that people can kind of along the path figure out how am I going to take care of, all of this financial component to it.
Well, what I see, I feel like I've talked with so many gay couples throughout my career and helped a lot of people have babies and help them through their journey. And what I see really, really commonly is that there's a lot of information out there and people tend to get completely and totally overwhelmed. And, maybe I have a bias because I am a reproductive medicine specialist, but I feel that's the place to start because we have access to all those things and we can put all those things together. Finding a person to carry, getting the reproductive psychologist, finding the egg donor, connecting you with good agencies, with good lawyers, as well as, ultimately making your embryo, putting the sperm with the egg, making the embryo and transferring the embryo to the uterus. So I do feel like a physician who's a reproductive medicine specialist, specializes in vitro fertilization. This is what we do every day. And, so a place that's experienced in donor egg and gestational surrogacy, which you could find through MedAnswers or through Resolve, organizations like that. I feel like that's the best place to start, because they're going to tell you about your health and your fertility and keep you medically safe. And if they have experience, they should be able to access all the things like agencies, lawyers, things like that.
Now, Serena, when two men are coming to you to have a family, do both typically go through a semen analysis? Do they usually come in with one partner who wants?
That's a good point, because sometimes you'll have, everybody's different. So sometimes you'll have, and sometimes we see single guys as well who are not part of a couple. But when you see a gay couple, not everybody wants to be a genetic dad. But a lot of times both of them want to be a genetic dad, and we'll look at both of them in terms of semen analysis and genetics and general health and things like that. But it really depends on what you want. And unless some people come in and they don't necessarily know what they want because they don't really know what's possible. And I think that's why, it's good to start before you're really ready, and just to have conversations, and maybe meet a doctor, maybe even meet two different doctors and get educated.
Now, we also have, seen and heard, and this is something that sometimes can lead to controversial conversations, but we also have seen 2 embryo transfers where they don't know who the embryos are genetically tied to, where the couple has created a embryo.
I think most programs don't recommend that. I don't think that's recommended by ASRM or the Mental Health Professionals Group, because they feel like, number one, ultimately everybody can find out what their origins are, and that it's better to have as much transparency and disclosure as possible, at least within the family, the parents and the children.
And the sentiment, I think, when this first kind of emerged on the scene was really, we are one family and genetics don't make a family. And we've seen that in third-party reproduction as well. But you're right, the mental health professionals in particular have really promoted, knowing as much as you can about your origins, and that helps children develop a healthy sense of identity.
Yes.
Which is an important consideration. And yes, these are 2 really giant conversations, because in the absence of egg, you need an egg donor. In the absence of uterus, you need a uterus. And so those decisions do add some weight and I think some time to the timetable. So the earlier that a couple starts having the conversation, or a single dad starts having a conversation, it's also easier to financially plan for such a big investment, and either get creative with borrowing from 401k or against your annuity. There are lots, I think, of good financial planning resources to help people access it, but those numbers really are daunting. And it's good to hear that more and more legislation is trying to be helpful in providing access, at least like insurance coverage for the surrogate and so forth. But I think that the reproductive psychologists involved can really help with that as well, because I think it feels so overwhelming. And so many of you have great psychologists in the clinic that if you just take the first step, get in for a consult, and it can actually include a reproductive psychologist so that folks can kind of weigh, right, all the different options. And, the thing that of course is difficult in that scenario for me as a patient advocate is if they want more than one child, that means going through the process twice. And
yeah, that's true.
And then that's really expensive, which I think is hard to argue for a single embryo transfer under that scenario. I do, argue for single embryo transfers, but I do understand that it's a difficult conversation to try to convince.
It is a difficult conversation, but I did have a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine who is a gay dad of two singleton kids, 2 separate transfers. And he also happens to be a maternal fetal medicine specialist. So he specializes in high risk OB.
Okay.
And he said, he said you know, Serena, like people think one and done and it saves you money, but they're thinking only about the cycle.
Exactly.
Bottom line is parents of twins, usually twins, the, you know, the average time that twins are born is at least a month early, many of them
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
And early kids can require special care. You could have some debilitating medical issues, which obviously carries its own cost. But even if they're healthy preterm, because there's two at once and they're early, you know, he's like, most of the time, at least one of the parents has to stop working. There are all
the
these
risk
other
for the
costs
surrogate.
that are, they're outside the cycle costs. And, you know, people are not really thinking about that. And if you add all of that stuff together, it may really be a wash, even though it seems like upfront doing two separate cycles is costly. But you have to look at a more global picture, and certainly, you know, the health of the babies and the health of the surrogate long term are really obviously very paramount. So it's hard, but right now ASRM definitely is like single embryo transfer. That's really what they recommend.
Yeah. Now it seems like with surrogates that there is a high rate of multiples. Is that just because the uterus is lush and there's a lot of splitting that can happen of the embryo even in a single embryo transfer? Or is it because historically we were doing 2 embryos?
I think historically we've been doing a lot of 2 embryo transfers.
Okay, so
that trend has changed.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. Okay, it's a good. It definitely is very important that is trending in the right direction. You know, I think for us, you know, we keep going back to the bottom line on Monday Motivation is get in for the first appointment. Don't let the numbers scare you. There's lots of resources to surround yourself with, but that first appointment to really understand all your options is really the key. And for those of us who are allies and believe all paths to parenthood are wonderful paths, you know, they're not always a straight line, and we're here to join you in advocating for greater access. And, you know, if you live in a state where you feel like there's not great access, certainly contact us on the platform FertilityAnswers, contact Resolve. We're here to support you.
Absolutely.
Serena,
information is the biggest thing, because you don't want to
That's right.
feel like you really got a personalized recommendation. So important.
That's right. Well, as always, so thank you so much for joining me. We'll see you all next week as we continue our Pride conversations.
Yeah. Thanks, Alice. Have a
Thank
great day.
you.